The Prince of Persia series has a long and mostly illustrious history. The original game is one of the most important, not to mention best, 2D platformers of all time. Sands of Time, the game that started the second trilogy, is perhaps not quite as important, but is every bit as good and is certainly the greatest 3D platformer available for the PC. With that in mind, one could perhaps be forgiven for thinking that this latest Prince of Persia, which is presumably the first of yet another trilogy, might be similarly excellent. It isn't. For anyone not familiar with the Prince of Persia series, the games have two core mechanics, platforming and combat. So you'll run and jump around the environment, you'll dodge traps like spikes sticking out of the floor that Tomb Raider stole, and those cool metal jaw things you have to jump through that Tomb Raider also stole. If we were to reduce Prince of Persia to a formula, it would be running plus jumping plus trap avoiding plus combat. The latest Prince of Persia game has running, jumping and combat, but no traps. There are no traps in this game. This is a Prince of Persia game without traps. A Prince of Persia game without traps is like a Tomb Raider game without tits. It makes no sense, and it makes the game lack any real excitement. But perhaps the game's biggest problem is that it disregards one of the most fundamental, most elemental aspects of gameplay: risk versus reward. Almost all games with a competitive element are based around the concept of risk versus reward, the idea being that your progression throughout the game is at every step of the way in jeopardy, and that the reward, which is progression through the game, comes at a price, the risk of death or failure. This is one of the more important ways gamers are kept engaged and interested by their games. When a game decides to neglect the concept of risk versus reward, the results are invariably disastrous. They were with BioShock and the Vita chambers, and they are here. Your companion, the princess, prevents you from dying. Ever. Misjudge a jump and plummet into a chasm, and the princess will magically grab hold of you and pull you up to safety, allowing you to immediately try again ad infinitum. Fall in combat and the princess will step in and defend you, allowing you to regain your composure and try again. There is no death or failure. The game is all reward and no risk. Undermining the primary source of the competitive element of a game makes it bland. If there is no challenge, no risk of failure, there is no satisfaction in success. It's like competing in a race where all the other drivers are parked at the checkered flag. All you have to do is put your foot down and you win the race. Where's the fun in that? The most tragic part of this is that they already nailed risk versus reward in the Sands of Time series. You could rewind time to make repeated attempts if you made a mistake, but this came with a tangible loss. The sand it costs to rewind time is limited, and the only way to replenish your sand is to kill enemies with the Dagger of Time. It's a near-perfect system in that it alleviates the tedium of failure by allowing you to immediately retry, but it's limited enough that it doesn't undermine the competitive element of the game. It doesn't trivialise the game. It also served to tie combat and platforming aspects together, making them feel like two sides of the same coin, which they were. Indeed, the prince in the SOT trilogy was very acrobatic and made great use of his acrobatic abilities during combat, making the combat a joy to play and a pleasure to watch. In Prince of Persia, the combat is an utterly separate entity, and when combat begins, you're locked into it, and the game gives you a sort of side-on camera, kind of like a fighting game. Much like the platforming element, you can't actually die here. You have no health bar, but the screen turns red when you're injured and the prince's animations reflect his injuries, so it's pretty easy to see when you're not doing so well. But if you take too much of a beating, all that happens is your opponent regenerates a portion of his health. This could mean fights could go on forever, but the fights are pretty easy. You can string combos together by hitting the right buttons in sequence, or you can just mash the attack button repeatedly and occasionally block when the game prompts you to. These prompts are quick time events, but on reflection, the entire game is actually one big quick-time event. Quick-time events in games are usually quite visually spectacular, the trade-off being that they require very little player participation. I mean, it's cool to watch some fantastic cutscene, but pressing a single button at a visual prompt isn't exactly a venerable gameplay mechanic. And yet, somehow Prince of Persia has managed to turn the entire game into a quick-time event. The video you've been watching just now was pretty visually spectacular, pretty awesome. Now watch again, and this time I'll show you the buttons I pressed in order to perform these feats. Yeah, so that's like 8 buttons in total, and only once did I have to hit a directional key. So not only does the game offer no challenge whatsoever, it demands no real player participation. It's the platformer equivalent of shooting fish in a barrel. It's boring as hell. The story is equally boring. You randomly hook up with the princess and together you go and stop some evil, which you do by collecting balls of light that are strewn throughout the game. The game ends interestingly enough, though it will come as no surprise to anyone familiar with the core themes of the Prince of Persia series, and sadly enough it leads us directly into a sequel. The best thing about the game's story is that you can mostly skip it. The game only forces the bare minimum of storytelling on you, and then much of the story is told through voluntary dialogue you can initiate with the princess. But both characters are so utterly tedious, and their generic action movie one-liner jokes and their overt sexual innuendo becomes tiresome after just a few minutes. You want to kill both of them, and you may try to, but you can't. The game won't let you. Oh, and they pretty much stole a line from System Shock 2 as well.
What is a drop of rain compared to the storm?
What is a thought?
What is a thought
Compared to a mind?
What is one grain of sand in the desert? One grain amongst the storm.
Another issue with the game is that because it's pretty non-linear, there's no difficulty curve at all, besides combat becoming slightly more complex as you progress. So not only is the game boring and easy, it's consistently boring and easy. There are no highs, no peaks, no cool set pieces or moments of distinction. Each and every level is exactly the same. If you can tolerate it, the game is about 10 to 12 hours long, with each of the 24 levels taking about half an hour. The good thing about this is that you can play the game in bite-sized chunks, 20 or 30 minutes, and still get a sense of accomplishment at having completed levels. But getting to the end of the game is an utter chore. The one thing I can praise is the visuals. The game's huge, often panoramic environments are an utter pleasure to look at, and the visual style suits Prince of Persia well. After Prince of Persia Emo Within, the game that killed the pop franchise for me, it's a pleasure to see a return to the more storybook style that helped make Sands of Time so great. Perhaps the finest aspect of the visuals are the animations. They're completely authentic and the transitions between actions are utterly seamless. Given that the original Prince of Persia was, I believe, the first game to use rotoscoping to achieve its lifelike animations, it's fitting that Prince of Persia continues the tradition of magnificent animations. And yet, as great as the visuals are, the game is running in the Assassin's Creed engine, and really we've seen all this before, except in Assassin's Creed the environments were perhaps even more spectacular due to the sheer number of models on screen at a time. Prince of Persia is beautiful looking, but the visual style notwithstanding, we've seen it all before, and arguably in a better state. The visuals are impressive though, and the audio is similarly pleasant. Much of the music is fairly forgettable, but there's one particular song that plays throughout the game that evokes a sense of wonder and really enhances the overall beauty of the game. The sound effects as a whole are decent, with nothing standing out as particularly great, while both the protagonist and the princess seem to be voiced by Americans, which had me grating my teeth throughout the whole game.
It looks quiet.
Don't say it's quiet. Don't ever say it's quiet.
Prince of Persia has stripped away the most important things that made the original Prince of Persia, its sequel, and the Sands of Time such great games. The horse died with the release of Prince of Persia Emo Within, now they're just beating it. The great tragedy is that Sands of Time is proof that Ubisoft's Montreal is capable of being the foremost developer of three-dimensional platformers, and yet they continue to struggle with, or perhaps deliberately disregard, the most elementary aspects of the genre. Challenge, difficulty curve, and player participation. Prince of Persia is consistently easy, boring, and there's very little to actually do, plus the characters are annoying and their interactions are tedious. And there are no fucking traps.